Laura Hulthen Thomas, and we're going to be discussing her story, Women Aren't Funny, from the Thames Review. I'm really excited to talk about this story with her. We recorded one back in 2020 when I was first starting out doing this podcast, and the sound quality was not good. So I'm excited to record another story with her. Hey, Laura.
Hi, Kelly. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well.
I told you to brush your hair and I didn't brush mine. Okay, well, I am so excited to talk about the story. I already did this little intro while I was waiting for you, so we can just dive right in. I mean, it is quite a story, and I was just laughing so much because this woman, Mona, is like telling all these jokes throughout it. Well, I guess I'll back up a little bit. Where did the idea for the story come from? I always like to ask that first.
Well, first, I want to thank you for having me today and hosting me and spending time with my work. And I just want to say what a big fan I am of your stories and your writing. And I have The Answer and Garden for the Blind are two of my very favorite short story collections. I've reread them so many times. So thanks for having me. Yeah, the inspiration for the story. There were so many inspirations at the time I wrote it. It was sort of like a collision of inspirations. I had just read that Christopher Hitchens quote that opens the story about women just not being able to do humor because humor is preemptive and aggressive. Of course, there are references to the political situation of the time, which of course is now upon us again. But at the time, there had been, pretty upsetting election. And then and there was a lot of narrative at that time about women voting for someone that you wouldn't expect women to vote for.
Right.
And there was a lot of, energy and discussion around women, the good, the bad, the ugly, I guess. And then I was thinking a lot about that quote from Margaret Atwood about how, men are afraid women will laugh at them and women are afraid that men will kill them. So all of these, and then at the time I was also just dealing with some grief issues. There's nothing autobiographical at all in the story. So I just want to put that out there right away. But I was thinking about sorrow and grief at the time. And so all of those things and I, had younger children and was sort of in the throes of some of the more difficult things about being a mother. And so all of those things just sort of hit me in this story all at once. And I just brought it all of it, to Mona.
So I was just thinking about the fact that it seemed like it looked like it was sort of like a pandemic era story, or just before the pandemic. Was it just during the first?
It would have been before the pandemic.
Like 2016, 17, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. This would have been just before. I was actually if I can share this, I was working on the first draft of this at a retreat with you, actually.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah.
So that would have been before the pandemic when we were together. So.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's talk about that quote right at the beginning. So where it says that humor can be aggressive, because I definitely got that feeling from all of the jokes. Every joke, I don't know how you did it, but every joke hit the wrong way. Like they were I was like, Bona, you are so annoying. These are ridiculous. That's hard to get all of those it's just slightly off kilter jokes in the story. How did you do that?
She just wasn't on her game.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
There was just that anger coming through, that sort of sorrow. Just everybody would make a joke and then she'd make a joke. And it was like, where did you get that?
Exactly. I'm glad that's the effect that you got from it, because that's the effect I was going for. And I was careful to not, in the beginning, it talks about how she used to be funny.
Yeah.
And I was careful really not to reveal that to the reader. That's very, we don't hear her jokes back in the day, so we don't really know how funny she used to be, but others used to think that she was funny at the very least, and now no one thinks she's funny at all. Father-in-law's polite, but of course the mother-in-law isn't having any of it,
Right.
So, right.
Yeah. Well, it was funny because I was like, were you really funny, or were you just thinking you were funny before? Because she was so off her game. It was really, really brilliant. she makes some observation. She says perhaps women stop being funny when they start trying to be. What
That's
did you?
and that right. That's kind of what I was going for with what we were just talking about, where she's really, I don't know if she's othering herself or feeling othered, feeling on the outside because of her grief and guilt. But, it just gets to the point where you think she's intentionally landing clunkers, even though she's trying with all her heart to sort of get, in the spirit of this pact that she's made with her husband, that, we just, grief was killing our marriage. Let's try this humor. And yet she just can't land it. She's just not feeling it. And
Right.
once you try to be funny, and there's a reason to battle your sorrow or your anger in a way that just isn't natural to you in that moment, maybe you're just not ready for it, even if others are.
So it opens with that scene with the knife, and it is really throws you, you know, I want to say off kilter again. I don't know why that word, but I mean, that's how I felt through the whole story. Just like I was trying to get my bearings all the time and I couldn't quite do it. And I was like, wow, what is he doing here? What is this? What's this scenario with the knife? So I'd love to hear you describe it since I have you here. Like what you were thinking with that scene.
I was just thinking, I was thinking of what, what if your husband did something as a joke that was quasi aggressive and your neighbor happened to see it, or in this case, the neighbor's kid and the neighbor's dog. And, again, it's kind of echoed in the doctor scene where what happens when something is innocent and then you're having to be put in a position where you're having to protest. Well, no, it really wasn't that my husband was holding a knife to my head. You automatically start to sound defensive, like you are, you know,
Hiding
it's
something.
out of control, right? And so I just had this vision of Bo holding this knife to her after she, jokingly says, "Oh, you need to chop the veggies to be uniform, honey, or else they won't cook." And it's just such an ordinary thing to say, but then they've turned it in their pact to turn everything into a joke. This sort of minor domestic comment, whether it's a critique or whether it's just the thing you say when you're cooking together, like every single time, those patterns you get into with domestic life. His joke is to turn it into the gangster moment and, just say, what you talking about, with that gangster, you want a rough chop? I'll give you a rough chop, like the old 50s gangster, what is it, Jimmy Cagney, deal there. So,
Right. They had a good, it's like they had a good shtick going before Steven's death. And then after that, they just can't get their rhythm going again.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And now, again, the grief and that, is spilling out into the public, is spilling out into the open. And, you know, then the neighbor, of course, comes and asks her, hmm, what's going on in your household?
Yeah. So tell me about that. Because I was thinking, so she comes over and she didn't seem to know much about Steven or even at all. But is that because she has so many kids that she didn't even really notice that she'd had a child? Or I wasn't sure if they moved there afterwards. Maybe I missed that, but
Right. They moved there. They've moved there since then. And so Mona is actually, the neighbor's name is Jen. Jen has all these kids, crammed into this rather small house and is very busy and has just had another child. And of course, this sets off Mona's grief anew. So Jen has just given birth and Jen comes to check on her and says, my girl and my dog saw, your husband hold a knife to your throat last night. Are you okay? And of course, Jen is standing there on the porch and, the baby's sort of crying from, the yard next door and Jen's milk lets down as it does when you're nursing. And just hearing that, are you okay? That's what Mona really wants to hear the most is someone in her family saying that, her parents are no longer with her and she's, feeling very, very alone in the wake. Her son died a year ago in the story. So it's been and she's actually unsure in the story whether Jen knows she's having a child and whether she knows she's lost the child. They're not close.
and Jen is sort of a sinister character in that she is very, very, she has no sense of humor. She's got this somber look about her. The kids are really somber too. The baby's crying. And it's like almost like until the baby's hysterical, she doesn't even notice. And then there's, the fact that she never leaves the house. And the fact that she's picked up on this so quickly, I was like, oh, well, what's going on in your house? Was that intentional too? Or-
Yes, I don't know how much of that was intentional. I just had this notion of the business of motherhood. We have a lot of children, and we've just had another one. And we may run a tight ship over at Jen's house, and everyone is sort of it's summertime, so it would make sense that the kids weren't in school, and all of these children are taking care of each other. And yes, Jen takes a beat, to talk to Mona before she goes and nurses the baby. And I just feel by the time you're on, I mean, certainly with my second child, I wasn't necessarily rushing to, you know, by the way I would, with my first, who, I was wrapped around his finger. And by the second one, I was a little bit less, well, I can feed him in a minute, and by the time you've got a brood like Jen, I have to imagine that you're going to finish your conversation before you go over the hedge for another nursing.
Yeah, yeah. You're like, oh my God, another adult is visiting. Yeah. So then there's Bo's parents, and and the fact that they have built this bunker, and the addition of the base and all of the political angst and all of the paranoia that started to surface in 2016, and we are still experiencing now. That really added another layer to this story. I'd love to hear about your thoughts on Bo's parents and what their relationship, what you envisioned of their relationship.
So I will say that the bunker idea did come from an anecdote that I heard. I was at dinner with some friends, and one of the, well, acquaintances, let's say. I don't really know the people very well who told me the story, and I also don't at all know the people they were talking about. But we were just chatting, and the subject of just these, bunkers. This would have been before the pandemic as well. So around that time frame you're talking about, when we were all feeling, like, well, what's going to happen now? We people are armed and out there, and there's been a lot of trouble around this election, and things were feeling pretty newly unstable at that time. At least they were for me. And in any case, we were just talking about more and more people are building bunkers, sort of rural places in Michigan is what they were talking about. And someone's at the table, their in-laws had built this bunker, and they had really outfitted it nicely and everything else, but they didn't like their son-in-law. And so they weren't going to make any room for him. And so if excuse my French, if the shit went down, he wasn't welcome.
Oh
And they
my
were,
God. No way. That's
and I thought
crazy.
it was
What?
crazy. And I
Yeah.
thought, what chutzpah? I mean, that you just like your, someone, a relative, perhaps the father of, your daughter's children, like so intensely that you were already planning that in the end times,
He's not
everyone's
coming.
coming in for you.
Well,
And they
they're
were like,
assuming that,
are you serious?
yeah.
And does he know this? And they're like, oh yeah, they told him, like
Oh
this
my,
is just that was their family's thing, the line in the sand, and it was just like, we don't like the dude, so he's not getting in. So of course, I could not believe it, and therefore I had to write about that. I mean, how could you
of,
not write
of course,
that
you have
scenario?
to.
Right.
And, they're assuming that their daughter would be willing to go down without him, and the kids, if they're a kid.
Exactly,
My
which has been
gosh.
pointed out, but they just are very firm, or were, I guess, very firm in their beliefs that this is how their reality was going to roll out in the end times. Also, I was just stunned by thinking, if everything ends to the point where you're needing the bunker, the fact that you would even be thinking about like who to take revenge on because you just like them so much, like
Right.
that just blew my mind. And in all, I'm laughing about it because I really could not believe it when I was listening to it. But in all seriousness, that made me think about the deep rifts in family that can just supersede even the end of the world.
Yeah.
And the grudges and the grief and the anger that one can carry through the apocalypse,
Right.
when if the hurt is deep enough, right? And I don't know anything about why this person was a problem, didn't go there. I just, we went on to other things and talked about like how they had outfitted the bunker and what cool stuff they had in it. But of course, I changed the facts so that it was, the in-laws excluding the daughter-in-law. And of course they, particularly the mom-in-law, Betty, cannot move past the death of her grandson and suspects that there's more to the son's passing away than Mona or Bo are letting on. And it's really about, the depths of her grief manifesting in this really, awful, awful way.
I was wondering whether Bo did tell her something about the death, or she is just running her own little investigation of what happened. And she's concluded that it couldn't possibly be that it was a crib death and that her daughter-in-law was involved. So do you think that Bo said anything to her? Because it wasn't clear in the story. I know that Mona immediately assumes, oh my gosh, he told her. But I could see that she was that kind of personality. She's a conspiracy theorist. So of course she would think that her daughter-in-law was involved.
Absolutely. And those are the questions I just want the reader to think about.
It could go either way.
It could. I deliberately did not reveal whether Bo would have said something to his folks. There are little hints in the story that he could have, because he's sort of lied to her about some other things that in that moment she's realizing that he's told her something that isn't true. And that particular thing doesn't get resolved in the story either. So it leaves the door open that Bo is usually not all that demonstrative with his folks, but she notices that when they come to dinner on this particular night, he's more emotional with his folks. He hugs them. He's just a little bit more closer to them. So yeah, there are hints or suggestions that maybe he did confide in his folks, that there was more to the story. But on the other hand, he, as part of their pact to continue on with their marriage and, for them to reestablish a healthy relationship, it was very clear that he felt like his parents could not know the true circumstances. And so it depends on how much the reader trusts Bo. And you're right, Betty is absolutely the type who wants to know. And I think a mother-in-law and a grandmother, of all the people on earth, a grandmother would want to know, right? What happened. So I think she would go after that.
I felt like he really set her up, because he said to her, oh, my parents have missed you and they wonder why you haven't come over, and they're sad about it. And then she gets there and she gets attacked. And part of me was like, oh, that's how it works. Sometimes the parents are very attached to the son. The son has no idea his parents, when he leaves the room, act differently toward the other person. But that does happen. So it could go either way. Yeah.
Indeed. Yeah. I think, Bo, it's clear that Bo wants to be the consensus guy, the reconciliation guy. Let's make this okay. Let's move forward. And that means moving forward with my folks, who are after all local, and they're my folks. And, they think that you're avoiding them, so he's guilting her a little bit. And I think Bo genuinely, my read on Bo is that he really does want things to just move forward. That we've had this loss, we've grieved, and let's be a family. And then yes, he steps out of the room, and Betty phones in and takes Mona.
Yeah, she's unbelievable. And I really related to the fact that Mona was like, oh my gosh, I was making this all up, and she really does love me, and she's she's trying her hardest, and she's grieving. And then she turns around and says exactly what Mona thought she was going to say. And I was reminded of all those studies that people do. Recently, I've read a lot of studies about how when you're watching a person, or you're noticing some sort of, I mean, it can be paranoia too, but you do get feelings from people, right? In interactions, whether it just can feel a little bit hostile. And I think as women, we're kind of conditioned to doubt that, and to say, oh, she couldn't really be doing that. And then, of course, you can get really screwed that way. I don't want to generalize, but it seems like a lot of times it's more of a masculine trait, or it feels like more of a masculine trait to be on guard. And women are not chastised for being on guard, but we're rewarded, right, for being warm and open and loving. And I don't know. It's interesting. I mean, being
Yeah.
on guard was warranted there.
I like what you say about that. And I also feel that Mona in that moment, so Mona has every reason to. I don't think she's ever had a close relationship with Betty, but certainly, the death of Stephen, really cleaved that. And clearly, Betty has not been very forgiving or sympathetic in the wake of that death. And of course, Bo left Mona. Mona assumes that, he was getting solace, and that's when she thinks maybe he did reveal to them, although he said he didn't. So Betty and Ted have every reason to, be wanting to protect and support their son. And of course, some of that may be at Mona's expense a little bit, right? I mean, that would be very natural since there was this rift in the relationship. But that moment also reveals to Mona that she is missing a mom of her own, because as soon as Betty does seem to be showing her a kindness and a belief in the future, that there can be a future, Mona kind of melts for a moment there and says, wow, I hadn't realized how much I missed having a mother, and I can meet this woman halfway. She has made what is for her a difficult sort of gesture to me, given our history and she's not, she is very aware of Betty's grief. I mean, Mona knows very well what her own loss has been. And of course, she's not unsympathetic to the fact that Betty is having her own feelings. And so I think in that moment, Mona's being very genuine. There's a little bit of gaslighting going on there per your remark. I think that's absolutely true where, Mona's better instincts probably should have made her guarded. But, I think that in that moment, she was giving Betty like genuinely the benefit of the doubt. And like you say, women are maybe expected to give that benefit of the doubt and to say, you know what? She's opened up to me. I'm going to open up to her. I'm going to feel vulnerable. I'm going to be a woman here. I'm going to be nurturing. I'm going to be that. And then, of course, Betty swoops in for the kill. And then Mona recovers right away and gives it back to Betty a little bit. So there's, real back and forth there between those women. And I really wanted to show a time when neither of them, until Mona recovers, neither of them are trying to be funny at all. I mean, Betty was never on the let's be funny to get over this thing anyway. She was going along to get along and to support her son. But in that moment, women are not funny in that moment. They are, neither Mona or Betty. It's a genuine moment. At least I hope it is. And yeah, I don't think a moment like that would have happened with Bo, for example, where I think a mom and a grandma, having that moment is just, a different thing, right?
I was just so blown away by the scene that you created when Stephen, when it actually happens, when we get the full scene, and it's so fully imagined. It was incredible to me, just all of the steps that Mona went through there, sort of in her disassociated state. And I almost was going to have you read it, but then I thought, no, that could be really traumatic for somebody because it is about the death of a child. But I thought, wow, you've really imagined all of the thoughts that went through her head, all of the steps that she was maybe going to cover it up, not covered up. And so I just wanted to talk about that a little bit. Did it take you a while to get that down? And did you have to do any research into that? Because you said it's not autobiographical. So
It's not the story's not autobiographical at all. I wrote that scene pretty quickly, to be honest with you. I don't I wanted Mona, I just wanted that to be a really hard scene to read and to process in the way that it was hard for Mona to live through that. And yeah, I guess I channeled all my fears as a mother. Although again, the story, I've not lost a child. I've certainly made mistakes as a mother, and I've also, my children have had some close calls, right? I mean, I think all our children have, where, if they had crossed the street just a minute earlier, they would have been hit by that car, or, any small number of things. And so I've had those nightmares. So I channeled my ultimate fear as a mother into that that moment.
You did an amazing job of writing something that was just so horrific, and it is like the scariest thing that could happen to a mother. And so to be able to sit with it that long, because my tendency writing a scene like that would be to write, you know, one paragraph and get in and get out, or maybe partially remember it because she's dissociating. So I would think, oh, I can get away with having this be very vague, but instead you did the opposite and you were very detailed. So I thought it was amazing. Okay,
The
so
other thing I'd like to say about that scene too is it was important to me to portray how exhausted
yeah,
and this is not necessarily related to gender. You can be a mom and a dad and have that exhaustion, but just the early, well, you can be exhausted with teenagers as well, but the early years when it's just you're just the level of exhaustion becomes dangerous sometimes, and it can be hard to even recognize when you have reached that point. It can be hard to ask for help. Sometimes there isn't help to be had, even if you could ask for it. And I just wanted to communicate just how impactful that is on in this case a woman, but it can be anyone doing any type of caregiving. The kind of exhaustion that leads you to make mistakes and to disassociate and not be yourself and not recognize yourself.
yeah. I mean, those midnight feedings when you get up and, I did that. You're not supposed to lay down with the baby, and I totally did by the third one. I mean, you have to. You're so exhausted. There's no way you can get through it.
Right.
And then all of we were told one thing for one baby and something else for the next baby,
Exactly.
right.
Exactly.
So it was
Right.
hard to keep up with like all of the, medical advice we were getting. And it's a really you need a village actually to
And
raise a
many of us
child.
don't, if any of us, many of us do not have that village. Many of us are a village of one, or
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 two at the
two
most.
at the
Yeah,
most.
right. No, it's terrifying. Okay, so let's do this final scene because I was just thinking about how I was wondering, first of all, how long it took you to get that final scene down because I just imagined that you must have wondered, is this going to work? What are people going to think of this? Or did it come to you really fast?
Again, that was just such an outgrowth of what was going on. And it harkens back to the knife at her throat, of course, that
Yeah.
began the story. And so I knew as soon as the story began that way that that's exactly how it was going to end. And so I was building up to that, all along, just in the back of my head, in the rough draft for sure. I knew that there was going to be, this thing. And my kids were in Boy Scouts, and I just well remember those Boy Scout knives. And my husband was a Boy Scout, so he has his knife from whenever that was, way back in the day. And I knew it's going to be a Boy Scout knife, and there was going to be a violation of the blood circle.
So, and then they're joking right up to the very end and they're playing the gangster and the whole thing. And I was like, oh my God, I cannot. And then how do you get out of a bunker in a situation like that? He's definitely going to bleed out there. But tell me a little bit about like, were you imagining,
It was just a flesh wound. It was really, yeah.
yeah, I wasn't sure. I was like, he could be really, really wounded or you didn't.
He could be. Yeah, that's up to your imagination.
Yeah. And I kind of love that you did that too, because it could be very serious or it could be nothing. But either way, the marriage is pretty much over at that point, I would think, or at least the relationship with the in-laws. What were you thinking might happen to all of them after that scene? Because I
Well,
don't know how you come back from that.
I don't know. I don't know either. Yeah, I think that's up to everyone's imagination. Can they pass this off as a joke? And Bo is so forgiving. He was coming at her at the same time that she was doing this jokey movement that he's done to her a
Right.
million times. And again, like when a guy does it, it's hilarious, right? And then when
I
the
know
woman tries to
everybody's
do it,
laughing
he
along.
slices his throat. Of course, you
Right.
know, because women aren't funny. So
Right, right. Oh my God, that was so great. I don't know why I found it so, I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm like a violent person, but I found it so cathartic because they were all being so mean to her. And I just thought, this is perfect.
Yeah,
Like
it's you know,
she,
the whole passive aggressive stuff, and then she ends up, being the aggressor at the end
right, right,
in a very passive
right.
sort of way. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. She didn't really mean to do it. It's not
Right.
like she, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Um, so hold on. Now I lost the thread of my next question because I was just envisioning that scene so much. So they keep repeating that phrase, keeping things light. And that's how they attempt to cope with the trauma, the humor, with the humor. But I thought about that in the scene. I just thought about keeping things light in so many ways here in terms of how we try and gloss over everything. And then we end up in a situation where the base has their bunker and everybody's on opposite sides of things and no one knows what anyone's really thinking. And people are telling, either ridiculous jokes or just talking about nothing in particular. And you really got a sense from this story, the isolation of that when you cannot communicate clearly with people around you or you're afraid to.
Hmm.
And also, it was a great metaphor what happened with Stephen for how you don't really know. I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but over the last few years, it's been harder and harder to tell what people are capable of or how you should feel about people. Like, I don't know. Does that make sense?
It does. It absolutely does. And that was also what I was hoping to get across in the story is how, we all have our personal lives, our personal dramas and our issues, and many of us carry personal sorrow from traumas of one type or another. And before you know it, there's stuff going on in the outside world that is also triggering those same sort of trauma, I don't know, effects in someone. And so those can feel deeply personal, even though it's in the political realm, but then it's may spill out into your community and people may start building bunkers and arming themselves, and folks you've known for a long time may change ideologies, and all of a sudden maybe you're the only one sort of left in your neighborhood, who doesn't share that ideology that once upon a time, that sort of shared sense of principles has shifted. And for some folks, well, for many folks, but especially for folks who suffer the after effects of, grief, trauma, that shifting, that shift can feel like very personal and very evoke that grief and evoke that same sense of of the threat being very personal. And sometimes, I just when writing the story and also just thinking about how I responded to, some of those outside events myself, thinking about, did I have my head in the sand? Like, when did this happen? I was taking care of my kids. I was managing, my job. I was, dealing with, whatever personal shit, I was dealing with. And all of a sudden, like, I'm in this group of white women, and some of these white women have put this guy into office, and people are arming
How that,
themselves. It's, right?
yeah, like when did this happen? Yeah.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
where, like, why didn't I get that? It's not like I don't, know a lot of people of various political stripes and that I don't listen to. I mean, we're writers, we listen, we watch. You
But
don't have,
also, yeah, I mean, I'm totally with you on all of that. But I was thinking about how dangerous it is on a personal level. Like the fact that, Stephen dies because partially, well, who knows why, he maybe just died of,
he could have just
in,
died a crib death.
yeah,
If
he
he
could
got
have.
sudden, he could have.
Yeah, you don't
She
know.
doesn't know. She
No,
doesn't.
she doesn't know. But the fact that she was that exhausted, that she had no support system, that she's surrounded by these people that, are suspicious of her, and probably even before this happened, weren't the nicest people. I mean, I'm just guessing,
But you don't know
because,
that either,
well,
right?
we don't know
Yeah.
that. Maybe that's all evolved, right?
Until they became suspicious of her.
Right. Exactly. We don't know. But
Hmm.
it just made me sad because it's not like you're, you know, when you think about community, it's not exactly a community, right? And it is dangerous when that happens. Okay, but I know we're using up all the time on that. I have two last questions. This is 11,000 words, and that is notoriously, I mean, that's a lot of words for a short story. So tell me a little bit about trying to get this published at that length. Was that tough?
I was so grateful to the Thames Review for accepting it. I can't even tell you because they said they love the story and the length never came into it. As you know, I write notoriously long stories. My stories tend to be more of the novella length. They are very hard to place, and so this story was is exists in a much longer form. And so I was laughing a little bit about whether the marriage could survive because, of course, I know what happens because there's so things do go on for Mona and for Bo and all. And it's actually part of a longer work of linked novellas, and that is not yet published. Excerpts from Jen's side of the story have actually been published as well.
Oh, and
Um,
where are those?
that Jen's story I did craft into a pandemic era story, and it's called "Stay Home, Stay Safe," and that is online at failbetter.com. And
Okay.
that's another long one, and they were happy to publish that too. So it's hard to publish long stuff, but I really like writing longer things. I like to get into the heart of characters. I like those really comfortable moments to play out a little bit. And I like to read longer stories myself. So, I do what I do, and sometimes they get published and sometimes they don't. So grateful this
Well,
one did.
well, they remind me of Alice Munro stories. So, and they're so full-bodied, so complex, and just they feel like reading a novel in a short story. So I'm glad that you write them long.
Thank you.
Tell me, when is you have a novel coming out? Can you just tell us a little bit about that before we finish?
Yes, I do have a novel coming out in about a year. It'll be released in March of 2026. It's called The Meaning of Fear. And it's like Women Aren't Funny. It's very different from Women Aren't Funny, but it's pretty deep dive into the lingering effects of traumatic childhood episodes and how that can play a role in one's adult life, and how it's just very, very difficult to not have your life and the way the choices you make shaped by those by what you're carrying forth in terms of pain and sorrow, but also how that same pain and sorrow will be in and of itself a kind of hope, and make you see things and do things that you might not have, thought that you could ever see or do before. So that's sort of the theme of the novel. The actual storyline is about a behavioral researcher named Leah Johnson. And one day a trespasser appears at her home. He seems threatening to her husband, who's himself been the victim of a recent crime. And so her husband kind of overreacts to this young man being on their doorstep. Leah doesn't really see what happens. And so her husband just says the kid ran off, but then the kid comes up missing. And Leah suspects it may be her husband, who really hasn't been himself at all since he was attacked. Leah suspects maybe her husband isn't telling her the full truth. And then she gets involved with the investigating officer, who has quite a bit of baggage of his own and is dealing with his own marital difficulties, and takes maybe more of an interest in Leah than, he should, and kind of loses objectivity, and things unfold from there.
Yep. And I've read it and it's great. So I can't wait till it comes out. Thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. I hope everybody reads the story because it's fantastic. And I just had so much fun talking about it with you.
I did too, Kelly. Thanks for the great questions, and I appreciate